You are listening to the QFM. Manifest your reality.
My passion is the mystery of the self and who we are as individuals, and demystifying those concepts. And I've spent the last at least 30 years of my life looking into what that means from a scientific standpoint. And I think that truly science is the contemporary language of spirituality. I think science is the language of mysticism. And I'm not one of those people, and have never been one of those people, that take things at face value, that I have a passion to investigate, and it helps me close the gap on a personal level to understand who we are. And if you look at quantum physics, the physics of possibility, it's really talking about the spiritual aspect of ourselves, because you couldn't explain a miracle, you couldn't explain a biological process, you couldn't explain a simple healing of a cut at this point without understanding the quantum model of reality. And that there are particles, which are matter, it's you and I, and everything in this physical world, and then there's energy. And that energy has a consciousness, it has an awareness, and that energy is a field of information that we are an extension of, that we have access to. And that we spend so much of our life looking outside of ourselves instead of looking inside of ourselves. And that we are really conditioned to look just for particles and matter instead of energy and information. And truly, when people reach the end of their beliefs or they're facing crisis in their life, that's the moment they start to turn within and start to ask the bigger questions. And if you were astute enough to look at this in moments of contemplation, if you were wanting to hide God anywhere, it would be a good place to hide. It would be within the human being, because everybody's looking outside of themselves, and we look for reasons to change and regulate our emotional states. We think that things and people and external things will really fulfill emotions that we're trying to change within us. And that truly, when we start to really investigate who we are and look to see how we do that and demystify it, I think once we start to demystify it, it can become a skill. And so Descartes, the 17th century scientist, he was very interested in studying the nature of reality. He was passionate about it because he wanted to do extensive research on cadavers, and he wanted to understand the world of the very large and how planets rotated around the sun. But he had a quandary because the church at the time didn't want him to change any of the current beliefs. So he made a very, very split decision sitting by a fountain one day, and he said, okay, the best way that I continue to do my research is I am going to study the physical world of the very large, of objects and matter, and then everything that has to do with the mind, it's too convoluted and it's too unpredictable, we'll leave that to the church. So science was always matter, never mind, and the church was always mind, never matter. And the two are never to be combined. And he actually separated the idea of the mind-body connection. He thought there was mind and there was body, and it was cut off at the neck. And he did that purposefully because he wanted to get the cadavers from the dead, from the church, and be able to do his research. So he was appeasing everybody in the process. And so that became the revolution of the time. And then Newton came along 100 years later, and he said, I have the scientific laws to be able to prove everything that Newton said. He basically provided the underpinnings of understanding the nature of reality of the very large. The predictable world of Newtonian physics says that we can really predict where the planet's going to be in a certain amount of time, and we can shoot a rocket to the moon. And this whole idea of studying the very large an apple falls from the tree, we can figure out how fast it falls because it accelerates towards the Earth at the same speed. And Newton was a genius, and he said, I'm standing on the shores, just on the shoreline of how big this really is. And this is what I can contribute. But he was a mystic in a lot of ways. And again, he didn't want to go against the convention at that time. So a couple hundred years later, Einstein shows up, and Einstein was a super cool guy because he spent a lot of time inward. And at 12 years old, he asked himself this simple question. If I ride my bicycle at the speed of light, and I turn my lamp on, I turn my headlight on, will it go on? And so he thought about that question every single day of his life, every day of his life. He would go out in a boat on a lake as a child and lay on his back in the boat and look up at the sky and think about this. And he was building models of understanding. He was working his best to be able to figure out how light and energy were related. He did it for 10 years. He was possessed by the concept. And finally, he was working as a third-rate clerk in a Swiss patent office, and he was watching this man fix the roof across the way. And he just paused for a moment, and he was watching him, and the moment he was watching him, he got this incredible vision. And he understood how light and energy were related. It was a very abstract vision. And it was so abstract and so dimensional that he had to go back to school to learn the mathematics to be able to explain what he saw. And his wife, his first wife, was an amazing scientist, and she helped him with a lot of the mathematics. And so when Einstein began to figure it out, he narrowed it down to that one simple equation that E equals mc squared. Energy and matter related, and the currency converter is the speed of light. And so it became very interesting because when Einstein published his papers on relativity, he didn't say like, hey, this person said this and this person said this, and I'm going to footnote this person do that. He just said, ladies and gentlemen, this is how it is. And it rocked the scientific community because he didn't really need anybody else as a reference. He had a discovery, and his discovery was so unique. And his brain really was wired for the understanding of light, and light was the ceiling of this reality. And so Einstein and Planck started doing these really interesting experiments where they were taking energy and they were putting energetic impulses into metals. And what they were looking to see is if electrons behave the same way as the very large. In other words, when an apple falls from the tree, it falls in a very specific way. It falls towards the center. It falls towards the larger body. So he reasoned, well, if we disturb electrons, and him and Planck were doing these experiments, if we disturb these electrons, then they should fall just like an apple falling from the tree towards the nucleus. It should be predictable, just like it's predictable in Newtonian physics and classical physics. Well, when they started disturbing the electrons, something very unusual happened. The electron gained energy, then it lost energy. And it gained energy, and it lost energy. And it gained energy, and it lost energy. And instead of it falling like a ball rolling down a hill, it was like a ball rolling down steps. And all of a sudden, they became very aware that the subatomic world, the very tiny, didn't behave like the very large world. And so then they started to look for the electron. They started to try to measure it. And everywhere they looked for it, it appeared. And when they turned their back on it and they no longer looked to measure it, it went from a particle that collapsed, called collapsing the wave function, back into energy. Now this was a revolutionary moment because this meant that subjective mind, your mind has an effect on the objective world, that mind and matter are somehow correlated. And so this birth of quantum physics came along, and this quantum physics experiments say that you cannot do a quantum physics experiment without an observer around. In other words, a mind always has to be present because it will influence the outcome. You with me? So now, that invisible field of spirit, that invisible field of information and energy, somehow you, as an individual, can influence the nature of reality with your mind. Manifest.
manifest your reality.